talk for March 2023. I'm Peter Cannell. I'm on the leadership team, and I'm going to be talking about the second letter to Timothy. And this particular talk is all about words, the words being a very powerful thing. So I've entitled this talk Words, Words, Words for a reason, and as we go on, you'll see why. First of all, before we go any further, the second letter to Timothy is the middle of three letters that Paul wrote that he often bunched together and I only discovered when I was actually preparing this talk, they're often best considered to be studied as a set of three. They all have slightly different purposes. Timothy is in Ephesus, and Paul is writing to him about some of the problems that Timothy's finding in Ephesus, and he's also writing to Titus about the problems he's finding in Cyprus. But essentially, these three letters are apostolic letters. They're written to Timothy and Titus to deal with problems that they were finding in the church, and because of that, they contain some really good practical advice about the oversight and running of churches and things like this. This isn't down to this is shall we say, leadership level. So it doesn't deal with theology and then practical tips. This is practical all the way through. So they're worth reading as a set and studying as a set. But this time we're looking at the second letter of Timothy, chapter 2. I want to pull out three particular verses first. I'm going to say in no particular order, but they are in a particular order because that's the way they appear in the letter. And it sets the tone from chapter 1, where we've already heard Paul complaining about people just going on and on about genealogies and myths and things like this, and just saying, look, forget it, this is just a waste of time. And to re-emphasize this, get into chapter 2, and Paul is already going on, keep reminding him of these things, warn them before God against quarrelling about words. It has no value and only ruins those who listen. Now this might sound a bit strange coming from a lawyer, because my business is words. And words have discrete meanings, and we can argue about those meanings forever, to be perfectly honest. And sometimes court cases will depend on the meaning of those individual words. The point here, though, is when you get to court to argue about these things, it is because you are right down to a fine line where people cannot agree, and therefore you're down to sort of quibbling over words in contracts or words that people have said to each other. And I can tell you, really, it's quite painful. If people understand the true meaning of words, often the things will fall away if they have the same meaning. Just for example, you can say one word in a certain way and it means something to one person, may mean something completely different to somebody else. The classic one you'll hear if you've been around churches a lot is people tend to preach about the word love, and there are meant to be 5 Greek words where we use the one word love. And for us, love can just mean, I love the taste of that cake, which is just, it's quite nice, right through to, I love my country and my fellow man so much that I'm prepared to go to the trenches and to defend democracy, and if that means losing my life, I love them so much that I will put my life on the line for them. That's an extreme, but that shows you that the same word can be used both flippantly and also very, very deep, and often the context is important and things like that. But the main thing is, if you spend time quibbling about these things, you're missing the whole point about what you're trying to get to. He also goes on further and says, avoid godless chatter, because those who indulge in it will become more and more ungodly. This is the gossip, or, skeet. By the way, bit of an old unrepentant Manxie on this one. Skeet is news, gossip is something that destroys people. So skeet is just, well, was it traditionally skeet? Have you got the skeet? Was what's happening? Who's marrying who's managed to get their exam results, what was the crop like, or just general news about what's happening around the place. Whereas gossip is that sort of nasty bit where you're pulling to pieces. Oh, have you heard? Oh, isn't it awful? And you're spreading untruths, or maybe spreading words in a way that could be misinterpreted. The point is that if you spend time on those sort of things and not actually the core of what you're trying to do, all you're doing is you're creating this sort of community of gossips. And that's not positive. You're not building up people. You're not building up the community. You're just continually pulling things down. It's very, very hard to get away from it, but we have to be so careful about the words that we use and the context in which we use it. Don't just join in with the discussion, shall we say, about somebody that's not edifying. And then in 23 he says, don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments, because they produce quarrels. And the Lord's servants must not quarrel. Instead, he must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. And this goes back to those previous ones. Quarrelling and gossiping doesn't build the kingdom. It destroys communities. Even though the community of the gossips might actually seem to be that sort of, I'm in with the group because we're talking and we're sharing news, and it's that lovely warm feeling that we're all on the same side against whoever it is that we're actually being gossipy about. And sometimes, we do it without thinking, can I just share this for prayer? Now, is this for genuinely prayer because you genuinely love someone and you want to see a change? Or is it just because it's a way in church of doing gossip that does not appear to be gossip? And then the other thing is we can then start arguing about the most silly and trivial things. I was reading a history of the church in Scotland, and it's fascinating actually seeing how important in Scotland the church is for its current culture and civil society. It is in the Isle of Man. Historically, the church was the cement that held the communities together. Maybe not so much now. But the reason for telling you that was there was a split in the church. There'd been splits in the church in Scotland. The Presbyterian Church went smaller, 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 and there was one split that stuck out to me as being just showing how ludicrous the whole thing was. And the split was over whether you left the bread on the communion table or whether you lifted the plate and passed it round. When you are arguing about things like that, you've maybe missed the point. Now, I'm not saying that we do this sort of thing, but it's the sort of thing we need to guard against and be aware of. Is sometimes the things that we are gossiping about and talking behind the scenes about, are we actually just talking about something that's pretty trivial, unimportant, and actually is the result of that going to cause pain and upset and harm in the community? Are we quarrelling and having stupid arguments and foolish arguments over the most bizarre things? I've heard of churches where they complained about the colour that the room was painted in. I've heard of churches that have complained about letting halls out because they've spent so much on the carpet. I've heard of churches where people have complained about what people dress like when they turn up to church, right? Because the leaders didn't consider it posh enough. I've heard of people arguing about where they sit in the church, and at the end of the day, are these really, really important? Are they building up the kingdom? Are they core to being a Christian? Are they core to our mission to change the world? To go out into the world and make disciples and baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and to teach them and to spread the gospel. That is just, that's me in I don't know how many words, just saying, sharing the good news, getting out there, doing things. What is our core mission? Is the discussion that we're having helping us get to where we need to go? Is the discussion in inverted commas, building up the community? Is it encouraging people? Is it promoting the good works? Is it promoting community? Is it being there for God? Because if it ain't, why are we doing it? We're wasting breath. And in fact, we could be doing a huge amount of harm. Now I'm just going to do a sort of little digression. If you're going to read the 3 books, and I would recommend that you do read these 3 letters, they're on 5 trustworthy sayings. And in those trustworthy sayings, they're obviously, Paul has said these are trustworthy sayings. These are things that are almost like maxims, or whatever you want to use the word. Sorry about touching my nose. Maxims, or anyway, you know what I mean. Sort of things to remember by. Trustworthy sayings. And this trustworthy saying in the middle of this book is this: if we died with him, we will also live with him. That's the gospel. Right? If we die to self and die to Christ, die with Christ, we will live with him. In other words, if we sacrifice everything for Jesus and follow Jesus. That's the 2 commandments, isn't it? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength, mind, body, everything. Right? That's your first commandment. That's it. Dying to self and living for Christ. If we endure, in other words, if we keep on the race, if we keep on mission, we will also reign with him. If we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, in other words, if we walk away from what we said we're going to do, he will also disown us. Now, who's doing the disowning first? I think it starts off with us first. If we're going to walk away and say, no, we don't want anything to do with this, then God's going to go, well, fine, it's your choice. All right? If we are faithless, in other words, we don't believe in him, he will remain faithful. So God is always trustworthy and faithful, because he will not disown himself. Whereas if we are faithless, in other words, untrustworthy, we are disowning ourselves, and we are actually letting ourselves down. So the whole trustworthy saying is this: if we die with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. But if we disown him, he will also disown us. If we are faithless, he will remain faithful, because he cannot disown himself. That's the trustworthy saying. So, back to the actual topic. So Timothy goes on to say, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a workman who does not need to be ashamed, and who correctly handles the word of truth. Now, this doesn't mean that Paul's talking about us having to have degrees, having studied theology or studied law or English or something like that. What he's talking about here is being truthful and honest to the word. Right? Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a workman who does not need to be ashamed. Now, as Christians in this modern world, we all know that means when we're actually scared to actually say that we go to church, because we don't know how our friends and our work colleagues are going to talk about us if we do admit that we go to church. We also need to handle the word correctly, and that means if we don't understand, be honest and say it. And actually the best thing to do sometimes is to say, I know that my Redeemer lives. I have committed my life to him. I don't understand the question you're asking. I can't give you an answer to that, but I know someone who can, or I can put you in a way of someone else. And that stops the useless and pointless arguments. There's a great part in the book of Mark where the Sadducees decide they're going to try and catch Jesus out about, the resurrection of the dead. And they said, there's a woman who marries a brother, and then the brother dies, and she doesn't get a child, and under the Mosaic laws, she then marries the next son, and he dies before giving her a child, and then she marries the next son, until she's married all 7 sons. When she dies, who's she going to be married to? Right, now Jesus could have gone into a big theological discussion. What they wanted was to spend a lot of time just wasting Jesus' time arguing about pointless, non-essential things. And Jesus just cut them down very, very quickly. And to some extent, we have to have the wisdom to be able to do that, not to get drawn into huge arguments about, was it 7 days that God created the universe? Well, it was only 6 days if you read Genesis. Was it really so many years? Does evolution? Forget about all that. That's missing the point of mission. And the mission is that we need to get the gospel out there. And we need to be able to use the words correctly. And if we don't know how to do it, don't fluff it. Don't fake it. Be honest with the person. Because actually your honesty and transparency will speak volumes to the person that you're speaking to. Flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. In other words, don't get dragged into these arguments. Right? Don't get into the desire to want to be one of the mates, so you join in the argument, you join in the gossip, so you feel as if you're part of the team. Don't get drawn into that. Right? Pursue righteousness. In other words, look at God. Focus on God. Be part of that. Be faithful to what He says. Love and peace is what you should be aiming for. All along, you should be working, you should want to be with people who are like-minded. You don't want to join the gossips, you want to join the people who are God-focused, God-centered, and on mission. I keep talking about on mission, right? The modern way of putting it as in business speak is to say, keep your eye on the prize. It came from the American civil rights movement as well. You know, when they were struggling and they thought they would never get equality before the law, they kept saying, we will keep going, we will keep marching, we will keep our eye on the prize, which is equality before law and the equality of opportunity. That is important. We need to keep the eye on our prize, and our prize is not for ourselves, but for the kingdom as a whole. And the prize that we are looking for is to be able to go into the world. This is our mission. Go into the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. In other words, we go out and we give the message. We don't get dragged into spurious arguments over nonsense. We just keep focused on what we need to do. The eye on the prize. Salvation for us, for our community, for our friends, for our neighbours, for the stranger that we come across. That is our mission, and that is what we need to keep focused on. So, where does that put us? Well, it's the usual 4 questions. What does this tell us about God? God who is always going to be faithful, because He will never disown Himself. Ask yourself in your small group, what does this chapter tell us about God? What do the letters tell us about God? What is important to God? What does this tell us about people? Spend a few minutes asking that. Then the other 2 questions, which you'll know, what does this actually mean to me? Is there anything I need to change in my life, in my habits, in my approach to other people? And then finally, who am I going to tell about this? Who am I going to share this with? If you want to do something well, you have to practice. You can't just take it on board and not do it. For example, from my own business, and I'm sorry to go on about this, but hopefully it'll be a good example. As a barrister or an advocate, I can receive instructions. Those instructions will either come from a layperson, in which case I have to build up the instructions and get a clear idea of what's needed, or they would come from another professional, a solicitor or somebody like that. The ones that come from a professional legal person are referred to as briefs, right? Now, part of my training was to draft briefs, and when I have drafted briefs in the past, people have said, well, thank you very much, that's very helpful, you laid it out well, which means that at least I was taught well. I haven't written a brief for about 10, 15 years. And I had to write a brief the other day. I am out of practice. If there's something important to learn from this, the way to make sure I get good at it is to practice it, to do it, to try it out. It's no use just leaving it there and saying, yes, I've done that, I'll put that in the box, because it could be 10 years later before you have to use it again, and that's not good. So finally, apologies. Finally, to action. Read 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy and Titus. They're only very short books, shouldn't take you too long. And remember, these are actually, shall we say, practical letters that are written to people who are going in as troubleshooters into churches where there are problems, right? Where you have arguments and endless discourse about things that are not really important, where you're not getting an eldership put together and you need an eldership put together, or you've got elders in place that really shouldn't be there and something needs to be done about it. Okay, so these are very, very practical. People talk about these being letters that should be read by pastors. But since we all have a pastoral ministry, there's nothing to stop us reading it. They're in the Bible. We might as well access them and might as well understand what's going on. Avoid controversies. If you find yourself getting dragged into something, an argument about whatever it is that somebody's going to have a go at the church about, stop yourself. If you're having gossips and whatever, stop yourself. Ask yourself this question: is it key to our mission? By doing this, am I keeping an eye on the prize? Am I making the kingdom? Am I expanding the kingdom? Am I building the community? Because if I'm not, I'm into controversies and I need to get out. Stay focused on the mission. Don't get distracted. And finally, to do all this and to get practice and to get good at it, to get into good habits, you need to practice and practice and practice them. And the way to do that is to meet with each other, encourage each other, go on mission together. And by that, I'm not talking about disappearing off to the other side of the world. I'm talking about little things like going into the community, going down into Parliament Street, going into Andres Village, somewhere like that, just making a difference, going out into the community. So with that, thank you very much for your time and listening to my thoughts. Hopefully that will generate discussions. Best thing to do is to go away and test it. Just remember the Bereans were a more noble mind because having listened to Paul with an open mind, they went away and double-checked what he was saying. Best way to approach it. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope this has been encouraging.